Good morning, students. Welcome to classes on economics of capital market. Today, we will be dealing with debt versus equity instruments. So, this is the traditional classification of financial assets. So, we can classify financial assets again into two classes, debt instruments and equity instruments. First, let us focus on debt instruments. Debt instruments are assets that provide a fixed payment to the holders, usually with interest rate. So debt instruments provides a fixed interest rate to the holders of the debt instruments. So debt instruments provides a fixed income to its holders. So if a company issues debt instruments, then that company have to pay a fixed rate of interest to the holders of the debt instruments. The working of the debt instruments are similar to working of debt. So debt and debt instruments works in the same way. What is debt? In simple words, debt is borrowing money from someone and offering him interest rate and guarantee to repay the principal amount after a particular date. Debt instruments also works in the same way. If a company is issuing debt instrument, then that company is trying to borrow money from public. So if someone buys company's debt instrument, then that company is obliged to pay a rate of interest regularly to the holder or the owner of the instrument, and company also guarantees to repay the principal amount after maturity. So debt instrument and debt works in the same way. Debt instruments are considered to be less risky investment because it provides a regular rate of interest, a fixed rate of interest uh, at regular intervals. So debt instruments are less risky, and the returns on debt instruments are less volatile. So returns on debt instruments are mostly fixed. So debt instruments are considered to be safe instruments for investment. Examples of debt instruments. Bonds and debentures are examples for debt instruments. Now let us move on to equity instruments. Equity or stocks are securities that have a claim on the earnings and assets of a corporation. So if a person buys equity share of a company, then that person can have a claim on the earnings or profits of the company. So company is obliged to pay uh, a part of its profit as dividend to the equity shareholders. So if a company is doing well and if it is running in profit, then equity shareholders can make a claim on the company's profit. Interestingly, equity is actually taking money from someone and offering him part of ownership of the company. So, if you are buying an equity share, you are giving money to the company, and in return, company is giving you a part of its ownership. So, if you are investing in equity instruments, you will get a part of ownership of the company. You will get ownership of the company. So, you will be one of the owners of that particular company. So there is risk involved in this. If company is doing well and if company is running in profit, then you can claim a part of its profit. You can have more dividend. You can claim for more dividend. But if company is running in loss, you have to bear the loss because you are one of the owner of the company. You have to bear the loss. Examples of equity instruments are equity shares, preference shares, etc. Now let us move on to the difference between debt instruments and equity instruments. The first difference, debt investments represents a financial interest in a company, whereas equity investments represent an ownership interest in a company. So if you are investing in debt instruments, you will get a fixed income at regular intervals or a fixed rate of interest at regular intervals. Whereas if you are investing in equity instruments, you will get an ownership right in the company. So if you are interested in getting a fixed income at regular intervals, you have to invest in debt instruments. And if you are interested in gaining an ownership right in the company, then you have to invest in equity instruments. Now, the second difference, investments in debt securities typically involve less risk. So, if you are investing in debt instruments, you will get a regular, a fixed income regularly. So, the risk involved is very less in debt instruments. But in the case of equity instruments, investment involves high risk because if the company is running in loss, then you have to bear the loss because you are one of the owners of the company. The third difference, debt in, debt instruments have lower potential return on investment, whereas higher equity instruments have higher potential return on investments. Even though the company is running in profit, or if company is doing very well, debt instrument holders will get only a fixed rate of interest. Whereas if the company is going very well and if the company is having higher profits, equity shareholders or equity instrument holders can claim for higher dividends. So equity holders have higher potential return on their investment compared to debt instrument holders. Now the fourth difference, debt, invest, debt investments are less volatile investments compared to equity investments. Equity investments are highly volatile because if you are an equity holder and your company is doing very well, you can claim for higher returns, higher dividend. But if the company is doing very bad, if the company is running in loss, then you have to incur loss. So there is high volatility in case of equity instruments, whereas debt instrument will provide you a fixed return. So there is less volatility. There is only less volatility in case of debt instruments. So next difference, issuing a debt instrument increases the debt burden of the issuer company. So debt instruments increases the debt burden of the company, whereas issuing equity instruments will not increase the debt burden of the company. For example, even though a company is running in loss, company is obliged to pay uh, rate of rate of interest on debt instruments. Whereas if a company is running in loss, company need not pay any return, any dividend to the equity holders. So issuing equity will not increase the debt burden of the company, whereas issuing debt instruments will increase the debt burden of the company. Moving on to the next point, the holders of debt instruments do not gain ownership in the company, or they cannot make a claim on the future profits of the company. Whereas equity holders can claim on the future earnings of the firms or on the of the company. So here the holders of debt instruments, they are only paid rate of interest a fixed rate of interest. Even though the company is earning a higher profits, they cannot claim or they cannot ask the company to increase the rate of return on their bonds or debentures. Whereas equity holders can claim on the future earnings of the company because they are the owners of the company, and if the company is making higher profits, then they can ask for more dividend. Next difference, there is no voting right to debt holders. So, holders of debt instruments have no voting rights in the company, whereas holders of equity instruments have voting rights in the company. Because equity holders, the holders of equity instruments are owners of the company, so they have voting rights in the company. Next difference, during the time of crisis or trouble in the company, the bond holders or the holders of debt instruments are paid first before other expenses are paid. So even though the company is running in loss, the company is obliged to pay the uh, debt, the holders of debt instruments. So holders of debt instruments are paid first. But in case of shareholders, they are less likely to receive any compensation in the time of crisis because they are the holders of the owners of the company. So they will not get any compensation in the time of crisis. They have to bear the risk because they are the owners of the company.